Imagine walking through a quiet plantation in South Carolina, where the sun casts long shadows over fields that have seen centuries of toil. The air is still, the kind of stillness that feels almost sacred, until you hear it. Words spoken with precision, with rhythm and cadence that don't belong. Words that sound French. But here's the impossible part. These people have never left the plantation. They've never studied a foreign language. They've lived their entire lives in isolation, surrounded by the same fields, the same rivers, the same walls, and yet they speak like masters of a world they've never seen. It sounds like a story pulled from legend, something you'd expect to find in the pages of a mysterious novel. But this is real history, right here in the heart of South Carolina. A language survived against all odds, a language that shouldn't exist in the place where it was found. For generations, these families carried it quietly, passing it down from parent to child, from one secret gathering to the next, as if preserving a treasure the world had no right to know. Today we're going to uncover the mystery behind these words. You'll discover why a language so foreign could exist in a place so isolated. You'll learn about the hidden histories that most textbooks never mention, stories of resilience, intelligence, and cultural survival that were quietly unfolding behind the walls of the plantations. You'll see how the whispers of the past can carry the most profound truths about human endurance. As we peel back the layers of this remarkable story, you'll realize that what seems impossible often has a deeply logical explanation rooted in history, migration, and culture. But it's not just a lesson in linguistics or colonial history. It's a reminder of the human spirit's power to survive, adapt, and preserve itself, even under the harshest circumstances. By the end of this journey, you'll understand not just the how of this extraordinary phenomenon, but the why these families held on to this language, why it mattered so much to them that it survived through generations, and why in learning their story we can see reflections of our own potential for resilience, creativity, and connection to our roots. So stay with me as we step into the shadows of history, as we listen to voices that defied time and geography. Prepare to question what you thought you knew about language, isolation, and human ingenuity, because what you are about to discover is not just a curiosity from the past, it's a lesson for the present, and an inspiration for the future. By the time we're done, you'll see that even in the most unlikely places, life finds a way to speak, to teach, and to leave a legacy that refuses to be forgotten. And it all starts here, with a mystery that challenges everything we think we know about history, culture, and the enduring power of human memory. Before we talk about the extraordinary stories of language and survival, we need to understand the world these families lived in. The plantations along South Carolina's coastal region were not just large farms. They were isolated worlds, separated from the wider society by miles of marshes, rivers, and dense forests. Travel in these areas was slow and difficult. Roads were often nothing more than dirt paths, and the rivers that ran through the land could both connect and divide communities depending on the tides. For enslaved people, this meant their daily lives were largely confined to the plantations themselves, with very little contact with outsiders or travelers. These plantations were vast and self-contained. They were designed to produce cash crops like rice and indigo, and every part of the land was worked intensely. Enslaved people performed nearly all the labor, from planting and harvesting to processing the crops. Their world was defined by the work that needed to be done, the seasons that dictated their schedules, and the structures built to house both people and tools. Life was regimented and often harsh, yet within these limits, unique forms of community began to develop. Isolation shaped more than just the work and the daily routines, it shaped culture itself. Because contact with outsiders was limited, the enslaved communities had to create their own ways of communicating, sharing stories, teaching skills, and preserving their heritage. They could not rely on the outside world to pass down their histories or customs. Instead, these communities developed rich traditions, passed from one generation to the next through oral storytelling, songs, rituals, and shared labor. In a way, the isolation of the coastal plantations created a protective bubble for culture to survive and evolve. The geography of the region amplified this separation. The low country, with its tidal rivers and swampy marshes, was difficult for outsiders to navigate. Plantation owners sometimes visited, and traders might pass through occasionally, but for the enslaved people, these encounters were rare. Over time, communities became tightly knit, relying on one another for everything, from food and clothing to emotional support and education. The remoteness fostered resilience, creativity, and an ability to adapt. It also made it possible for distinct cultural identities to flourish, even under oppression. Within this isolation, African traditions mingled with elements of European influence, creating something entirely new. Language, music, food, and religious practices all took on unique forms shaped by necessity, memory, and the interactions among the people living on these plantations. Every song sung in the fields, every story told by a grandmother to her grandchildren, every skill passed down quietly became part of a cultural tapestry that was unlike anything outside those isolated lands. This environment of separation and self-reliance was not just a backdrop. It was the foundation for the remarkable survival of culture, language, and memory. The coastal plantations of South Carolina were more than sites of labor. They were crucibles where unique communities were forged, communities that carried pieces of Africa, Europe, and the human spirit into a world that tried to strip them of everything. In understanding this isolation, we begin to see how these communities could preserve elements of language that seemed impossible, keeping alive voices from a past that many believed had been lost. Before we talk about the remarkable stories that have puzzled historians for decades, we need to focus on one of the most astonishing discoveries in the South Carolina Lowcountry. Some slave families were reported to speak in patterns, words, and rhythms that sounded strikingly like French. The pronunciation was precise, the cadence unmistakable, and the vocabulary contained echoes of a language that should have been entirely foreign to them. It was not just a few words picked up here or there. Entire conversations, songs, and expressions seemed to carry the hallmarks of French speech. For anyone hearing it for the first time, it was nothing short of bewildering. What made this even more shocking was the context in which it occurred. These families had never traveled outside the plantation. They had no access to formal education in foreign languages. They had never interacted with French-speaking settlers, diplomats, or teachers. Their world was contained within the boundaries of the plantation, their daily life dictated by labor, survival, and community. And yet here was a linguistic mystery emerging, as if a distant culture had somehow found a way to travel across time and space and settle quietly in their mouths. The incongruity of hearing a language so refined in the middle of fields and cabins filled historians and linguists with questions. How could this be possible? This phenomenon quickly grabbed the attention of scholars and historians. It challenged long-held assumptions about isolation and cultural transmission among enslaved communities. Most research on language survival in North America focused on English or African languages, the expected outcomes of trade and forced migration. To discover traces of French speech patterns in families who had never left the plantation suggested a far more complex and nuanced history. Historians were drawn to the puzzle. It demanded explanations that went beyond simple exposure. It prompted inquiries into migration patterns, colonial influence, and the hidden pathways through which culture could survive even the harshest conditions. Beyond the linguistic curiosity, it sparked a deeper fascination. If language could survive and evolve in this way, what else had persisted quietly, unnoticed, across generations? What stories, songs, and traditions had been carried along with it? The French-like speech became more than just an anomaly. It became a window into a hidden world of resilience and ingenuity. It suggested that enslaved families were not merely passive victims of history, but active participants in preserving knowledge, memory, and identity. Scholars began piecing together evidence, comparing phonetic patterns, historical records, and oral traditions. The phenomenon drew attention not only for its linguistic oddity, but also for what it revealed about human adaptation. It showed that even in the most confined and oppressive circumstances, people could retain and transmit elements of culture in ways that outsiders might never expect. This discovery continues to intrigue, offering a glimpse into how communities can harbor surprises that defy conventional understanding, and why studying their language is key to understanding their full story. Before we talk about the French-like speech that appeared on some South Carolina plantations, we need to understand the rich and complex linguistic background that shaped the region. Enslaved Africans were brought from many different regions of the continent, each carrying their own languages, dialects, and ways of speaking. From West Africa alone, groups came with languages as varied as Wolof, Igbo, Mandinka, and Yoruba. Each language had its own structure, rhythm and vocabulary, and when people from these diverse backgrounds were forced together, they had to find ways to communicate. The result was often a blending of words, sounds, and grammatical patterns that laid the foundation for new forms of communication on the plantations. At the same time, the European plantation owners themselves were not a uniform group. While the majority were English, many came from other backgrounds, including French, Scottish and German. Their accents, customs, and ways of speaking were layered over the existing African languages, creating a complex linguistic environment. Enslaved people were immersed in this environment daily, hearing commands, instructions and casual conversations that carried the marks of different European tongues. These exposures, even if limited, left subtle traces in the way slaves adapted and blended speech. It is important to note that learning a European language under these circumstances was rarely direct or formal. Enslaved people rarely had access to schools or tutors, yet through necessity and observation, they absorbed elements of the languages around them. Some may have picked up words and phrases simply by listening to their masters speak, repeating instructions accurately to survive, or imitating the sounds they heard in work settings. Others may have learned indirectly through interactions with fellow slaves, who had had different experiences or exposure to European languages. Over time, these words and structures could blend seamlessly with African linguistic patterns, creating a new hybrid form of communication that was both practical and deeply rooted in cultural memory. This mixing of languages was not just accidental, it was adaptive. Enslaved people needed to communicate effectively with each other to organize work, maintain social bonds, and pass on knowledge. At the same time, they had to understand the words and commands of their masters to navigate daily survival. This constant balancing act, between survival and community, led to the emergence of Creole languages and dialects, rich with the rhythms of Africa and tinged with European influence. Understanding this context helps explain how elements that sounded French could appear in communities that had never traveled abroad. It was not the result of a single encounter or deliberate teaching, but the natural evolution of language in a unique social and cultural environment. Yes. The sentence, what of reefs of Niffernis, at a unique social and cultural environment. After bloke, what of reefs of Tav, the sentence trees of Tav, the sending. The combination of African linguistic roots, the influence of European owners, and the creativity of enslaved communities, produced a language that was fluid, resilient, and surprising to outsiders. It was a living testament to human adaptability, showing how culture and language can survive and transform even under the most oppressive conditions, creating patterns of speech that could astonish anyone who heard them for the first time. Before we talk about the surprising language patterns found among some enslaved families in South Carolina, it's important to understand Gullah, a language that has shaped the region for centuries. Gullah is a unique Creole language that developed in the Low Country, where the coastal plantations created isolated communities. It was born out of necessity, as people from diverse African regions were forced together, speaking many different languages, and needed a way to communicate not just for survival, but to preserve a sense of community. Over time, Gullah emerged as a blend of African linguistic structures and vocabulary, combined with the English spoken by the plantation owners, creating something entirely new and distinct. But Gullah is not simply a mix of African languages and English. It also carries traces of other European influences, including French, Portuguese, and even Spanish in some regions. This happened because the Low Country was a crossroads of colonial powers, trade, and migration. French Huguenots settled in parts of South Carolina, and traders or skilled workers brought their languages with them. Over decades, these influences seeped into Gullah, adding layers of vocabulary, expressions, and pronunciation patterns that made the language remarkably rich and complex. For people who were not familiar with the intricacies of Creole languages, some of these elements could easily be mistaken for French or another European tongue. What makes Gullah truly fascinating is its rhythm and sound. The language has a musical quality, with syllables and stresses shaped by African tonal patterns. Words are shortened or altered, grammatical structures are simplified but flexible, and expressions carry layers of meaning inherited from African oral traditions. When spoken naturally, Gullah can sound completely unlike English, even though it borrows heavily from it. This distinctiveness is why early observers were often shocked when they heard it. Some believed they were hearing French being spoken, when in fact it was the clever adaptive evolution of a Creole language formed under extreme circumstances. Gullah also served a purpose beyond communication. It became a vessel for culture, storytelling, music and history. Through Gullah, enslaved communities preserved African traditions, proverbs, and knowledge about the land, farming techniques, and healing practices. It allowed families to pass down identity and heritage despite the oppressive conditions that surrounded them. The language was both a shield and a bridge. It enabled secret communication among enslaved people, while also adapting elements of European languages for practical survival. Understanding Gullah helps explain the mystery of the French-like speech patterns recorded on some South Carolina plantations. To an outsider unfamiliar with the language's nuances, the combination of African-derived sounds, English vocabulary, and subtle European influences could easily be mistaken for foreign French speech. But Gullah was not imitation, it was innovation, a linguistic solution born from resilience and necessity. It illustrates how creativity and adaptation can thrive even in the harshest circumstances, producing something entirely unique, yet deeply connected to the cultural roots of the people who spoke it. Through Gullah, we can begin to see how history, language and survival intertwine in ways that continue to surprise and inspire. Before we talk about the ways language evolved on the South Carolina plantations, we need to understand the broader colonial context of the region. In the early colonial period, South Carolina was not exclusively English. French settlers, particularly Huguenots fleeing religious persecution in Europe, established communities along the coast and near the rivers. These settlers brought with them not only their language but also their culture, their customs, and their ways of thinking. Although they were a minority, their presence left an enduring mark on the Lowcountry, influencing the social and cultural landscape in ways that would echo for generations. The French settlers spoke their native language in homes, churches and markets, and they interacted with both English colonists and enslaved Africans. Their accents, idioms, and vocabulary became a subtle part of the linguistic environment. Enslaved Africans, who were learning to navigate the plantation system, absorbed fragments of this language as they overheard instructions, observed interactions, and adapted to daily life. Even small phrases, commands, or repeated words could be memorized, repeated, and incorporated into African-derived speech patterns. Over time, these French elements blended with English and African languages, leaving traces that might sound remarkably authentic to anyone hearing them decades or even centuries later. It wasn't only language that carried French influence. Food, customs, and everyday expressions all bore the marks of the French settlers. Recipes, cooking techniques, and the use of certain ingredients filtered into the diets of plantation communities, especially among those who worked closely with the colonists. Certain festivals, religious practices and social customs also carried French characteristics, subtly shaping the daily lives of both settlers and the enslaved people who observed them. Even the rhythm of speech, the way sentences were constructed, the cadence of words could reflect French patterns, especially when combined with African tonalities. The Huguenots' influence demonstrates how cultures can leave enduring imprints even when populations are relatively small. It also shows that language is not static, it evolves in response to social circumstances, contact and necessity. The interplay between African languages English and French in South Carolina created a dynamic environment where a new form of communication could emerge. This blending was not planned or deliberate, but it was inevitable, given the isolation of the plantations, and the mixture of people and cultures in close proximity. Understanding this French influence helps explain why some slave communities appeared to speak French, even though they had never traveled to France or studied the language formally. It highlights the subtle ways European culture intersected with African traditions, creating something entirely unique. Beyond language, it also reminds us that culture, identity and knowledge can survive across generations, adapting to new circumstances while retaining traces of their origins. The presence of French settlers in South Carolina was just one piece of the puzzle, but it was a significant piece, one that shaped not only speech, but the very rhythm, flavor and character of life on the plantations. Before we talk about the remarkable way Gullah developed, it's important to understand how Creole languages form in the first place. Creoles arise when people from very different linguistic backgrounds are forced together and need a way to communicate. In the context of the South Carolina Lowcountry, enslaved Africans arrived from many regions, each speaking distinct languages with unique grammar, sounds, and vocabulary. At the same time, European settlers and plantation owners spoke English, French, and other languages. With so many languages colliding in one place, communication required innovation. People had to find common ground, creating new words, blending sounds, and simplifying grammar so that everyone could understand each other. Over time, these hybrid forms stabilized into a fully developed Creole language rich in meaning and nuance. Gullah is one of the most striking examples of this process. It carries deep African roots, preserving grammatical structures, tonal patterns, and vocabulary from multiple African languages. But it also absorbed elements from English, which was the dominant language of the colonists, and subtle influences from other European tongues including French. The French influence may have come from Huguenot settlers, traders, or even enslaved people who had indirect exposure to French through the plantation environment. These European traces woven into the fabric of Gullah gave it unique sounds and patterns that set it apart from English or any single African language. To an outsider unfamiliar with Gullah, some of these sounds could seem startlingly like French. Words might resemble French vocabulary, certain pronunciations carried a melodic rhythm similar to European speech, and sentence structures could occasionally echo French patterns. Yet these elements were not true French, they were adaptations, shaped by the blending of languages and the natural evolution of speech under isolation. Enslaved communities were not attempting to speak French, they were creating a language that met their needs for survival, communication, and cultural preservation. In this way, Gullah is both practical and poetic, a living testimony to human adaptability and creativity. The mistaken perception of Gullah as French highlights the complexity of Creole languages. Outsiders often tried to categorize what they heard according to familiar standards. Hearing a few French-like words or intonations, they assumed the speakers had a direct connection to France, without recognizing the centuries of linguistic evolution that had occurred on the plantations. In reality, Gullah represents a fusion of multiple influences, a language that evolved organically from the daily lives, struggles, and ingenuity of its speakers. Understanding how Gullah formed helps explain why the language seemed mysterious and even impossible to some observers. It was not simply a language borrowed or taught, it was a creation born from necessity, isolation, and cultural blending. Every phrase, every song, and every expression carried layers of history, African traditions, European sounds, and the lived experience of generations of enslaved people. This intricate mixture is what gave Gullah its distinctiveness, and in some cases made it sound French to those who had never encountered its origins. It is a reminder that language is living, adaptive, and capable of surprising even those who believe they understand it. Before we talk about the French-like sounds in some South Carolina communities, it's important to look at the incredible ways Gullah people preserved their heritage over centuries. Despite the oppression and isolation of plantation life, they found ways to keep elements of African culture alive, especially through language, songs, and oral traditions. These were not just casual habits, they were intentional acts of memory, a way to maintain identity and connection to their roots. Certain songs, chants, and even stories carried linguistic patterns that traced directly back to West African languages, preserved almost perfectly across generations. These traditions served as a bridge to a past that the enslaved people could never return to physically, but could hold on to culturally and spiritually. One of the most striking examples comes from documented cases where Gullah families preserved old African texts or songs for hundreds of years. These songs were often passed down by elders to children, carefully memorized and repeated at work, during gatherings, or in moments of worship. Over time, they retained not just the words but the rhythms, pronunciation, and meanings that reflected African origins. Even in isolation, these cultural treasures survived, acting as living records of history. Researchers studying Gullah communities have found that these oral traditions were remarkably consistent, even when separated by geography or decades. This demonstrates how powerful and intentional the act of preservation was for these families. Some of the most compelling research comes from studies like the language Ukrainian, which traced the origins of certain Gullah songs and phrases back to specific West African communities. This work shows that families were able to maintain linguistic ties across vast distances and generations, keeping alive a sense of identity that might otherwise have been lost. Songs that were sung in South Carolina plantations centuries later matched patterns of language used in Africa, proving that cultural memory can survive even the most extreme disruptions. These findings amazed historians and linguists alike because they demonstrated a continuity of heritage that seemed almost impossible under slavery. The persistence of African language elements in Gola highlights a broader truth about human resilience. Even in situations designed to erase identity, enslaved communities found ways to preserve knowledge, history, and a sense of self. Every word, every chant, and every song carried layers of meaning, providing not only cultural continuity but also a way for future generations to connect with their ancestry. Families passed these traditions down quietly, with the understanding that memory itself could be a form of resistance. This preservation of language and culture also explains why outsiders were often confused when they heard Gola speakers. To someone unfamiliar, some words, phrases, or pronunciations might sound like French or another European language, when in fact they were deeply rooted in African traditions that had survived centuries of change. It is a testament to the power of oral culture, and to the remarkable ingenuity of communities determined to carry forward their identity despite isolation, oppression, and hardship. Gola is living proof that culture, memory, and language can endure when people dedicate themselves to passing it on, keeping history alive through song, speech, and story. In the end, the mystery of French-speaking slave families in South Carolina is both fascinating and revealing. While early accounts may have seemed impossible, the most likely explanation lies in the unique blend of languages and cultures that shaped the Lowcountry. Gola, with its African roots, English influence, and traces of French and other European elements, evolved in isolation to meet the needs of enslaved communities. What sounded like French to some outsiders was often a natural result of this linguistic fusion, a testament to adaptability, creativity, and cultural preservation. Language in this context is far more than words. It carries memory, identity, and history across generations. Every phrase, song, and expression tells a story of survival and resilience, linking the past to the present and reminding us of the power of culture to endure even under the harshest circumstances. Whether it's the rhythms of Gola, echoes of French heritage, or the persistent threads of African traditions, these voices reveal the hidden layers of human ingenuity and the unbreakable spirit of communities determined to preserve their roots. If you found this story as fascinating as we do, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more incredible histories and hidden truths that continue to shape the world around us.